Socrates said that we have to look at the city in order to zoom in and get a bigger picture of the soul of humanity. I wonder if the internet gives us a little bit of a zooming in on the soul of humanity as well. This interview with Russell Brand and Bill Maher, I know this is a strange introduction already, but frames the problem for me in that Russell seems like a very genuine person on a quest for truth, and Bill Maher seems like a person who's kind of adopted his own ideology and he's not really interested in looking at anything further. And so that really gives me a sense of what's at stake for the soul of humanity. I know that sounds like blown out of proportion, but as we look at what's going on in our time, in our day, at the soul of humanity, where are we going to find meaning and purpose and truth and answers? Where are we going to find it? Is Enlightenment rationalism failing? Has it had its day and we're starting to see the cracks in the foundation? And is there a spiritual awakening going on? That's what this interview set in my mind. So here we go.
Why are you wincing? It's something to be proud of. You're one of the few rock.
Why are you wincing? Why is Russell Brand wincing when Bill Maher starts to talk about his previous life as sort of a rock star and living the life that maybe some people would think is glamorous? Why is Russell Brand wincing?
Rockstar comedians.
Did you see me that way?
I still see you. Look how you're dressed. Look how you look. You played a rock star twice in movies, I think, right? Greek.
That's right.
And you married a rock star, and you were on heroin. I mean, you're a rock star, and you have the look. You have the look.
When you say it like that,
you can't buy that.
It sounds fantastic.
If you could buy it, I would have done it by now.
The thing is, Bill, is that whilst that sounds like a tremendous set of experiences, I was, of course, there while they were happening.
Although those sound like a tremendous set of experiences, of course, I was there while they were happening. So Russell is saying, yeah, it sounds great from the outside looking in, but in reality, all of those experiences, at least what it sounds like Russell is trying to say, is they amounted to nothing. They didn't fill him with what he was looking for. And I think that's what's at stake here in this interview. And part of the reason why I even wanted to share it, because some of what Bill Maher says is just not worth even repeating. It's grotesque. And yet there's this juxtaposition between Bill Maher and Russell Brand. Bill is kind of approaching everything from this sort of optimistic, humanist, idealistic rationalism, and Russell Brand is on a spiritual quest. He's thinking more soulfully about life, and he's looking for purpose and meaning and belonging. And so Bill Maher says, hey, you were on drugs and you had all this money and you had all these women and you were living this life and it was so great. And Russell, I mean, the comedy there, the irony of his response is, yeah, but I was there. So it sounds great. But when you're living through it, it's actually not that great. I find that fascinating.
Mostly rather bleak, in all honesty.
I find that hard to believe. People say that all the time when they describe this life that the rest of us could only dream of, with the women, and the drugs, and the adulation, the partying, and I'm like, why can't you people just enjoy this? I feel I certainly would.
Possibly there's a difference between Epicureanism, hedonism, and what I think I have, which is addiction. And I suppose addiction means that you're trying to remedy a spiritual, or possibly from a secular perspective, psychic condition through sort of external means. And rather than, I'm a joyous, piratical sort of sex buccaneer, for me, I was just on like a kind of, I'm unhappy. And also,
I was just unhappy. He says it was bleak. It was bleak and unhappy. And Bill Maher is just like, why can't you just enjoy this? Why couldn't you just enjoy this? And I think that, again, I'm not a fan of Bill Maher. So if you are, I apologize. I don't find him to be very interesting. He just has this very one-dimensional way of looking at it. It's very worldly. It's materialism. It's like, why can't you just enjoy all the guns and sex and heroin and rock and roll while you have it? Well, because there's more to life than those things, I think is what Russell is getting at. In his Joe Rogan interview, he said that there was a spiritual deficiency. He used the word deficiency. I thought that was a really good way of describing when he goes into addiction. There's a spiritual deficiency that addicts are trying to fill with their addiction. There's something missing that they're trying to fill.
So I'm like a...
By the way, Sex Buccaneer is the greatest name for a band.
Yeah.
If you ever start one. I'm sorry you didn't have a better time having a better time than the rest of us.
Look, actually, I'm not seeking any sympathy from it. I'm just sort of remarking, Bill, that like when I hear my life described, I think, oh my God, that sounds so cool. And indeed was everything I aspired to as a young man, trying, I think, to somehow mitigate feelings of unease and emptiness, probably in common with many comics and entertainers. And when I did it, it just did not work and has left me one of the few areas where I imagine we're somewhat at odds, only with a kind of spirituality as my last remaining option.
Why do we have to drag all this depressing psychological stuff into it when it...
Why do we have to drag all this depressing psychological stuff into it? I think he probably was going to say spiritual as well. I really don't get this. I really don't get Bill Maher's response. I mean, Russell is sharing his experience of addiction, his kind of quest for more than what life could offer. And Bill is just like, why are you bumming people out, with all this talk?
It just would be great to get a lot of drugs and... I don't understand why we have to overthink it and complicate it. And it's just like when I was...
really your position?
It is. And I will stand by it. I'm a one-issue candidate. Yes, I mean, just rockstar sex. I mean, is there a man alive who doesn't, at some point in his youth aspire to that? There certainly wasn't when I was 13 years old.
Bill is saying he doesn't understand why you couldn't just be content with all of these material pleasures in life. He doesn't understand. Great. You've admitted something that you don't understand, which I appreciate. And I think the reason he doesn't understand is that he's looking at the world from just a material perspective. This world is all there is, so why can't you just have pleasure in it while you're here? Whereas Russell is looking at it as more. This world isn't all there is. There is a spiritual world. There's an unseen realm. There's a supernatural world to be considered at the very least. You don't have to jump in whole hog into some wacko spiritual conspiracies or things like that, but just consider the fact that maybe there's more than just the material world. And then you begin to understand why some people are not content with material pleasures, material satisfaction, because we're longing for something more. And that's why I think Russell and Bill are this great kind of juxtaposition. It's the only really redeemable part of this conversation. Again, I'm not a big fan of Bill Maher, but I thought that this conversation was worth it in the sense that it really does draw kind of these clear lines between like Bill and Russell, the practical, idealistic rationalist, and the person on a pilgrimage, a quest for meaning and belonging and purpose and identity and something more.
What would you be if you could have anything? A rock star. The girls throw themselves at you. Right? Just girls throw themselves at you. You had me.
Absolutely, and certainly it's what I aspire to, but even in your description of it, it was an adolescent fantasy, and the problem with adolescent fantasy is that you grow up, I grew up, and I found myself inhabiting something that didn't endure for me.
It didn't endure past the adolescent fantasy. I think that's a really good observation, and I think we should take something here from Russell. Like, I feel like Bill could learn something from Russell if he was willing to hear what Russell is saying about his experience, about his life.
You describe me as an idealist, and I am an idealist, and I feel like what is idealism? I suppose is the suggest that there's a telos, that there's an object that I'm moving towards, and for me that's a sort of I don't know. Is it self-actualization? Is it redemption? Is it love? Is it to live a worthwhile life? I mean, what are all of the principles that we're discussing when we're having a conversation around politics? What's undergirding it if we don't have any ideals? I mean, if it is just the sort of brutal pragmatism of who gets what, and I know those sort of highly consequential conversations, but surely whether or not you believe in God or if you believe in America or whatever values you hold, we're sort of saying there's something we're aspiring to, there's some meaning. So to just wrap up what I feel about the hedonism is, I now know that what I sought out was the fantasy of a boy, and it doesn't work. It didn't work. Not to say that
it didn't work for you. It worked splendidly for Rod Stewart. So let's not let's not.
Did it? Did it work splendidly for Rod Stewart? Like, maybe, again, on the outside looking in, just like he's looking at Russell in the beginning saying, hey, you lived this life. It was a rock star life. You should be super excited about that and happy about that. He does the same thing. Now he's using Rod Stewart as an example, saying basically the same thing, except I wonder, and I don't know Rod Stewart, like, whatever, like, would Rod Stewart say that? Or is this just Bill Maher, again, looking on the outside, thinking that this is some great thing?
Lump. We're all different people. And from, again, I'm sort of being facetious about this, but the idea that because you went to this different model of marriage and children, whatever that is that people do, that means you grew up and I didn't. I must reject that because, again, I think you're projecting. It's not that I haven't grown up. Of course I've grown up, and I'm just as mature as some other immature people in lots of ways.
Russell uses Bill Maher's own words when Bill Maher says it's every young boy's fantasy to become a rock star. And Russell Brand takes that then and says, you're absolutely right. It was a young man's fantasy. And then I grew up and realized that it couldn't last. It doesn't last. It doesn't hold. It's not strong enough to endure. And then Bill takes that and says, I reject that. I reject that you're calling me immature. And then he has what seems like a pretty immature moment where he's kind of sitting there and fidgeting and saying, I'm just, well, and then he does use some humor, which is great. I'm just as mature as the next immature person. So he doesn't want to be labeled as immature and sort of has a fit about it. But Russell is using Bill Maher's own words there.
But no, I'm not. I don't feel like I'm immature because I never wanted to go into that model, which I have seen fail so much more than I have seen it work. And so.
Okay, fair point. Okay, so he says I wouldn't going into that model. I think he's talking about kind of spiritual awakening, the quest for meaning and things like that. The teleology, the telos that Russell Brand was talking about, the purpose, that underlines or undergirds existence. And fair point. Bill Maher is saying, I've seen that fail more than I've seen it succeed. Well, but he just said we're all different. There's a lot of people that see that succeeding and his model failing. So his model, I'm assuming, is naturalism. I call it humanism. I don't know that Bill Maher would call it humanism, but it's the sense that you are at the center. It's just me. I'm at the center, and that's it. So again, is this an example of how our kind of rational, self-centered approach to materialistic satisfaction is ultimately failing? He can't listen to someone use his own words and say, well, yeah, it was a boyhood fantasy, and then I grew up. How dare you call me immature? Something like that. You see how it's broken.
Oh, do I feel the need to spawn to be labeled a grown-up? I don't.
I'm not suggesting that the only route to maturation is to have a family or to procreate or even enter into sort of social norms around matrimony. I'm not suggesting that at all. The distinction I'm making is that for me, when I lived hedonistically, it didn't work. And I recognize that is different. I'm talking particularly as an addict.
But can I ask you in percentage-wise, what percent of it didn't work? Certainly, there must have been a little percentage that was fun. And then there was like a hangover. It's like if you ask me after I've had too much to drink, when I have a hangover, would you trade? No, I would love to trade. Yes, I would love to go back to last night and not be drinking. I would give that fun up because this is just too painful, but I didn't see it coming that bad. Is it like that? Or where there was no joy in Mudville? There was no joy before the pain?
A common trope around addiction is it was fun, then it was fun with consequences, then it was consequences. And
no,
for me, it was quite concentrated. Even now, I'm 20 years clean from substance misuse now, drinking drugs, and still.
This is where you say congratulations, right? It doesn't seem like Bill understands. Maybe I don't know. Maybe I'm just missing something. Maybe I don't get it. But it's like I hear people say, "Hey, man, I've been 20 years clean from addiction." Wow, awesome. Congratulations. That's great. That's great to hear. Bill doesn't offer that. He kind of goes, oh, okay. It's I don't know. I can
feel in me the palette of emotions and yearning that leads to overuse, for example, of substances. It was so clear that what it was in me was a sort of a psychic or spiritual yearning, a sense that this is not enough, the world. You know, and I'm talking now about the world I inhabited as a boy, as a child. Like, this isn't going to fulfill me. I need something else. I need, what is it, values? Is it community? Is it connection? Is it meaning, purpose? What is it? And I feel denied that. One of the things that concerns me, I suppose, about the secular framing of the ideological sphere is that once you extract a sort of a shared purpose that for me has to have a sort of if not a sprinkling of the divine, it's actually a divine crucible. Unless they're like, what is pleasure alluding to? That's what I'm saying, I suppose. Like when I'm like, sort of, if you're in love with.
What is pleasure alluding to? C.S. Lewis worked this out, right? And I think I'm probably going to botch his thing, but he's like, you don't desire things that can't be satisfied. And so it means that there's something else greater out there. If it didn't exist, you wouldn't desire it. You don't desire things that don't exist. Hebrews 11 helps us out here. So by faith, we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things which are visible. So the unseen realm is actually primary. It's first. The material world that we see and taste and touch, that's kind of secondary. It was made out of the things which are not seen. So Bill Maher is saying, why can't you just be content with the material world and the pleasures therein? And Russell's saying, well, there's more than just the material world. At least that's the impression that I get from Russell Brand. And that the unseen is there at the foundation of all of what is seen. So this provides us the context of what we're working through. Is rationalism going to be sufficient to answer all of our questions and desires, or is there something more? And I can appreciate Russell's quest for that answer. And it is sort of a spiritual one. And you could tell that he's not quite comfortable even talking about this with Bill Maher. I'm not sure what Bill is going to say when he's talking about the divine, and that's where his journey led him. Now, Hebrews also works this out. As it is, we desire a better country, a heavenly one, and therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God. For he has prepared a place for them. This is what we desire. This is what we're longing for. We're longing for the place that we were meant to be, in communion with God, in the garden, so to speak. But here he's remade it, and it's this heavenly kingdom, this heavenly city built by the hand of God for his people. And that is, we have this desire. We have this desire for harmony with God, harmony with ourselves, with one another, all in a place that we can call home, where we can belong. That's the desire. And I think that because if you are stuck, and again, this is what's at stake here. What's at stake is that we could become too much like Bill Maher. I'm not trying to be too harsh on the man, but that we're stuck in this, just looking at what is visible and not realizing that what is visible was actually made by things which are not seen, the Word of God. And the risk there is that if we're stuck, we've bought into the lie that this world is all there is, that rationalism can provide the answers, and that if you start to long for more than that you are being ridiculous, you're being superstitious, you have been deceived and deluded by some religious cult, let's say. Well, I think it's the other way around. I think that it's very easy to be deceived and deluded by the rationalistic cult. I mean, we even have this in Ephesians 4, and this even goes back to what Russell was talking about as far as being mature, right? For the building up of the body of Christ until we all attain the unity of faith. Again, this is that desire, that heavenly kingdom, the unity of knowledge. And again, is it that rationalism puts us in a box, a very narrow box of only what we can understand, so that actually we're not able to obtain full knowledge. I think that this interview gives that great juxtaposition. Russell seems like a person willing to learn, willing to listen. I don't get that impression from Bill Maher. So the knowledge of the Son of God, that would be the greatest thing to know, is to know God, to know his Son, to a mature man, to the measure of the stature which belongs to the fullness of Christ. That's to the maturing, the spiritual maturity that happens as you quest for that spiritual home. You can look at Paul Vanderklay's channel if you haven't already, the quest for a spiritual home. He's putting on a conference about that right now. I think that is one of the things that we desire. As a result, the mature man, the measure of stature which belongs to the fullness of Christ, the knowledge of God, and as a result, we are no longer to be children. That's that maturity again, tossed here and there by waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by the trickery of men, by the craftiness of deceitful scheming. But speaking truth in love, we are to grow up in all aspects into him who is the head, even Christ. People who have this quest for knowledge, a quest for something more than just the material realm, often get labeled as being sort of deluded or duped into believing, hocus pocus or whatever. And yet I think it's actually rationalism that is doing that to us to some degree. I'm not reason is great. So I speak against rationalism. I'm not speaking against reason. I'm speaking against the idea that from my mind, just beginning from my mind, that I can come into this knowledge of all things. You can't, because there's more than just the material world. We have to be able to see past that material world. And in order to do that, we have to have revelation. We have to have something revealed to us from beyond that material world. And if we just limit ourselves to that rationalistic box that I think Bill Maher is sort of trapped in, then I think we are these people tossed here and there by waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by the trickery of men, not the revelation of God. And that's the big lie, is that quote unquote spiritual people or Christians are duped into believing that these spiritual things revealed by God. When I think the rationalistic human, the rationalistic man has been duped into believing just the rationalism, the trickery of men, the craftiness of deceitful scheming. This is worldliness stuff. This is not divine revelation. This isn't the spiritual awakening stuff. These are all words that would indicate the true deception comes from believing that the natural world is all there is. That the knowledge of the Son of God requires that faith we were talking about with Hebrews 11, and it requires the revelation of God. And I think that, to me, is the antithesis of the kind of enlightened, rationalistic, optimistic, humanistic approach. That it's a humble one that says, you know what, I have to believe some things to be true in order for me to even go on this journey towards truth. I have to have faith. I have to realize that there's more to this world than what I can understand just with the brain that I have in my head. I have to be open to more. And the humility that is required to be open to that revelation from the divine, that revelation from God. I don't really see that in Bill Maher. I do see it in Russell Brand. That's what's at stake. That's the juxtaposition in front of us, to just be limited by our rationalism, or to have a spiritual awakening that comes from the knowledge of God being revealed to us. We're going to land the plane here.
Like sort of if you're in love with someone, or if you're making love with someone, or if you're high, what is it that you're touching? What is this ulterior thing?
So, who said art for art's self? Was it Oscar Wilde? Why isn't that the same thing as pleasure for pleasure's self? Why does it have to allude to anything? It is the end. Sometimes the journey is over. Some people, I think, just like to stay on the road. I like to be home. And home is like if you are, not every day is happy, of course, but a day when you're like feeling good, you have things to look forward to, you feel like you're doing something useful, and you also have pleasure in your life, excitement with other people and conversation, sex. I don't want to go further. Like that's it. Like as long as I'm on Earth now, maybe we don't know. Maybe in the next world, if there is one, there is some other dimension. But on this Earth, I'm not going to get to that dimension. Or you say you can through meditation and just that kind of stuff.
I think some people kind of cannot live without that dimension.
This is what Augustine is talking about when he said God has made us for himself, and our hearts are restless until we find rest in God. And Bill's idea here that he's not going to get to that other dimension, he's not going to get to that other realm, to me is a sad one. It's a throwing up of the hands. He's kind of done. He's not going to get there. He's not interested in it. That pleasure for pleasure's self is all there is. I find that, at least for me, I do find that to be somewhat sad. And maybe Bill Maher doesn't have that sense of what Augustine was writing about. That we are restless people. We are sojourners. We're not truly at home in this world. But he did say that. He said, some people just want to be home. But where is home for people, for humanity, for every one of us universally? Where is home? It's to be at peace with God, to be united back with God. I guess Bill doesn't feel that, and that's sort of sad. But there we are. That is what's at stake. That's the meaningful question in front of us. Which path are we on? Are we content with the material world? Or do we have that sense that God has made us for something more? And we're restlessly seeking. And not restless in a bad way. Hopeful of that journey and the end, that it's leading somewhere, and that there is more, that there's more to me than just the material. I'm not just dust. I'm dust with the breath of God. There is more to it. And so I appreciate anyone who is on that spiritual quest and that pilgrimage towards truth, towards the knowledge of God. So thank you for being here. And if you've made it this far, I'd love to either get a comment from you, subscribe. You can share this with somebody that you think would find it meaningful. And I'll catch you in the next one.